A man in a pastor's collar stood up from his front pew, his face twisted with disgust and anger. The bride stood at the altar in her white dress, radiant and hopeful. The groom beside her, John Williams, had just asked the pastor, his own father, to bless their union. And that's when everything changed. "I cannot bless this ugly union," the pastor declared, his voice echoing through the church. "You are too handsome to marry this ugly woman. Look at her. How could you do this to yourself?" The church fell silent. Not the peaceful silence of a sacred moment, but the horrified silence of people witnessing something they couldn't believe was happening. "Everyone, get out! We are done here," he commanded. My precious family, if you're watching this right now, I need you to do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button, and in the comments, tell me, what time is it where you are and what country are you in? Because I want to build a community with you and I want to hear from you. Let's connect. Now, let me tell you why this moment mattered so much. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story isn't about a pastor's cruelty in a single moment. This story is about love that refuses to break, loyalty that refuses to bend, and the kind of hypocrisy that God Himself would judge. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you're going to understand why that pastor deserved every bit of shame that came his way. John Williams and Tiana Johnson grew up on the same street in a quiet neighborhood where everybody knew everybody else. Their houses were just 5 blocks apart. And the kind of community where front porches meant something, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on. John was 2 years older than Tiana, but they didn't know each other well until high school. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of boy who helped his mother in the garden and worked a part-time job to have his own money. Tiana was energetic and bright, always laughing, always making people feel welcome in her presence. Their first real conversation happened at a neighborhood basketball game. John was sitting on the bleachers, and Tiana sat down next to him. Not because she knew him well, but because the bench was crowded and she was desperate for a seat. He moved over without being asked. She said something funny about one of the players, and he laughed. Really laughed. From that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't love at first sight in the way people describe in movies. It was something deeper and quieter. It was recognition. They started spending more time together. Walks through the neighborhood, conversations on front steps that lasted until midnight. He listened to her dreams about design and fashion. She listened to him talk about his family, his faith, and his fears about the future. By the time they were officially dating, it felt like they had been together forever. There was comfort in it. There was safety. There was the kind of love that grows slowly, rooted deep, the kind that doesn't need dramatic gestures because the everyday moments are already filled with meaning. Years passed. 6 years to be exact. 6 years of building a life together, of knowing each other's families, of being present for the small victories and the hard times. They weren't just boyfriend and girlfriend anymore. They were partners. They were each other's person. John had moved up at his job in logistics. Tiana was working in retail, but she had bigger dreams. They talked about marriage, about children, about the future. Everything felt right. Everything felt like it was leading somewhere beautiful. And then, one ordinary evening that would change everything, Tiana's parents had an accident. She was staying at John's house that night, which was something she did often. His mother, Gabrielle Smith, had cooked dinner and they were all laughing in the kitchen when John's phone rang. It was a hospital. There had been a fire at Tiana's house. Her parents hadn't made it out. The next hours were a blur of hospital visits, waiting rooms, and the kind of pain that doesn't feel real. Tiana survived the fire, but barely. She had severe burns covering significant portions of her body. She spent weeks in the hospital, wrapped in bandages, fighting through the physical pain and the emotional devastation of losing both her parents in a single night. The medical team warned her about infection, about healing, about the long road ahead. John was there every single day. Before work, after work, sometimes instead of work. He held her hand when she cried. He listened to her talk about her parents, the memories, the regrets, the what-ifs that haunted her. He sat in uncomfortable hospital chairs for hours, just being present, asking nothing in return except the privilege of being near her. His mother, Gabrielle, now brought meals to the hospital. His father, Isaiah Smith, who was a pastor at a local church, came to pray with her and offer spiritual comfort. For those painful weeks, the Williams family became Tiana's family. She had no one else. Her parents' relatives were distant, caught up in their own lives, and suddenly, Tiana was facing a world of grief and physical pain alone. But she wasn't alone. She had John. As the weeks turned into months, Tiana began the slow process of physical recovery. The burns healed, but they left scars. Significant, visible scars across her body. During the fire, she had also suffered burns to her scalp, and her hair never fully grew back. She would wear scarves and wigs. But the reality of her changed appearance was something she couldn't escape. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger. Now, the girl who had been bright and energetic looked different now. The physical marks of trauma were written all over her body. John's love never wavered, not once. When she cried about her appearance, he held her. When she said she felt ugly, he told her she was beautiful. Not because he was trying to be nice, but because he meant it. He saw her strength, her resilience, her determination to survive. He saw the woman he loved, who had been through hell and refused to let it break her. The scars didn't matter to him. The missing hair didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alive and she was his, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew she was loved. Gabrielle Smith, John's mother, became like a second mother to Tiana. She helped her with physical therapy exercises. She brought her clothes that made her feel comfortable. She never treated Tiana like she was broken or less than. She treated her like a daughter. Even Isaiah, despite his strict religious beliefs, came to respect Tiana's strength and her faith during this difficult time. The Williams family had adopted Tiana into their hearts. But after recovery, reality set in. Tiana wanted to work, to contribute, to feel like she was moving forward with her life. She had a degree in business administration and relevant work experience. She applied for jobs everywhere: retail management positions, administrative roles, customer service jobs. But interview after interview, the same pattern emerged. They'd call her for an interview, she'd show up, and she could see it in their faces. The moment they saw her, saw the scars, saw the wigs, or saw something different from what they expected, the energy would shift. They'd ask a few perfunctory questions, and then she'd never hear from them again. It wasn't that she wasn't qualified. It wasn't that she didn't interview well. It was that in a world that judges people by their appearance, Tiana's appearance had been permanently changed by something beyond her control. She was qualified, educated, intelligent, and hardworking. But none of that mattered when people saw her and made instant judgments based on her scars. The rejection took a toll on her. John watched her confidence erode with each rejection letter. He watched her question her own worth, even though he constantly reminded her of it. One evening, sitting on his apartment couch, he said something that would change the trajectory of her life. He said, "You've always talked about fashion design. You're creative, you have an eye for style, and you understand people. What if we did this? What if you learned fashion design?" Tiana was hesitant. It would be expensive, it would take time. But John was determined. He had been saving money. His job paid decently, and he had always lived modestly. He paid for her to enroll in a fashion design program at a local community college. He paid for her supplies, her materials, her books. More importantly, he believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. Tiana threw herself into the program. She studied design principles, learned to sew, practiced pattern making, and developed her own style. She had a gift for it. She understood how to create pieces that made people feel confident, beautiful, and seen. Her instructor, a woman named Zoe Clark, who ran a small design studio, recognized Tiana's talent immediately. By the end of the program, Zoe offered to mentor her further, helping her develop a small portfolio. For the first time since the accident, Tiana had a path forward. She wasn't waiting for someone to hire her based on their judgment of her appearance. She was creating something of her own. She was building something that couldn't be taken away from her. A year into her studies, John took her to their favorite spot, a small park near the neighborhood where they had grown up. He had packed a picnic, which seemed like a simple thing, until they got there and found the entire area set up with fairy lights strung through the trees. His best friend, Julian Brown, was there with a camera. His mother, Gabrielle, was there with tears in her eyes. And John got down on one knee with a ring that he had been saving for longer than Tiana even knew. "Tiana Johnson," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I have loved you since the moment you sat down next to me at that basketball game. I have watched you survive things that would break most people. I have seen you rebuild yourself from ashes, literally and figuratively. I have watched you grow and learn and dream. And I cannot wait another moment to ask you to be my wife. Will you marry me?" She said yes. Of course she said yes. She cried happy tears for the first time in longer than she could remember. Gabrielle embraced her. Julian cheered, and John, the love of her life, put a ring on her finger that symbolized a promise that he would stand by her, support her, and love her unconditionally. Forever. Their wedding planning began immediately. They decided on a date about 4 months away. Tiana was excited, radiant. John was already planning to take her to meet with his family to discuss the details. He took her home to his parents' house on a Saturday afternoon. His mother knew they were coming and had prepared a meal. His father, Pastor Isaiah Smith, was sitting in the living room reading when they arrived. John held Tiana's hand as they walked in. He was nervous, not because he doubted his love for Tiana, but because he knew his father had very strict views about many things. Isaiah was a good man in many ways, deeply faithful, committed to his church and his community. But he could also be rigid, judgmental, and unforgiving when he believed someone had fallen short of his standards. They sat down to eat. Gabrielle asked about the engagement, about their plans, about the wedding. Tiana talked about her fashion design studies, about how John had supported her, about how grateful she was for the Williams family. She was warm, genuine, and beautiful in her joy. Gabrielle beamed. But Isaiah barely looked at her during the meal. After dinner, John said, "Dad, Mom, Tiana and I wanted to talk about the wedding. We'd like you to be part of it. We'd like you, Dad, to officiate if you're willing." There was a pause. Isaiah set down his water glass slowly and looked directly at John for the first time that evening. "John, I need to speak with you Alone, he said. They went into Isaiah's study. Gabrielle and Tiana stayed in the kitchen, and in that moment, Gabrielle reached across the table and squeezed Tiana's hand. She knew something was wrong. And in the study, Isaiah wasted no time. "That girl," he said, "is not suitable for you. I saw her when she walked in. Those scars, that appearance. You are a handsome young man with a good future. You could marry someone whole, someone beautiful, someone who hasn't been damaged by tragedy. Why would you saddle yourself with someone like that?" John felt something inside him break and harden simultaneously. "Dad, I love her. She is beautiful. What happened to her wasn't her fault. She survived something terrible, and she's the strongest person I know. I'm going to marry her, and I'm asking for your blessing. But I will marry her with or without it." "Then you will marry without my blessing," Isaiah said coldly. "And you will do it without me officiating. I will not stand before God and bless a union with someone so unsuitable." John walked out of that study and took Tiana's hand. He didn't explain everything that had been said. Not fully. He just told her that his father had some reservations, but that they were going forward with the wedding anyway. They would find another pastor to officiate. They would plan it at a different church. And while his father's rejection stung deeply, it didn't change John's mind. It didn't make him question Tiana. It only made him more determined to show her that their love was worth fighting for. Gabrielle, however, was devastated by her husband's stance. She loved her son, but she also disagreed profoundly with Isaiah's judgment. In a marriage, she had learned to be somewhat quiet about her disagreements, but this was too much. She couldn't stay silent. She sat Isaiah down and begged him to reconsider. She reminded him of his faith, of the teachings of Christ about not judging others, about loving unconditionally. But Isaiah's mind was made up. He was a pastor, a man of principle, and he would not compromise on what he saw as a moral issue. "If you go to that wedding," he told Gabrielle, "there will be consequences when you return to this house." Gabrielle faced a choice that no woman should have to face: her husband of 30 years or her son and the woman he loved. She chose her son. She made the decision that she would go to the wedding, and she would walk Tiana down the aisle herself, even though it meant defying her husband directly. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in June at a church across town, pastored by Terrell Davis, a man who had known John since childhood and who was more progressive in his thinking. Tiana had finished her fashion design studies by then and was starting to take on small freelance projects. She designed her own wedding dress, a stunning white gown that showcased her design talent and made her feel like herself. It was elegant and modern, but it also had elements that celebrated her heritage and her journey. When she looked in the mirror on her wedding day, she didn't see someone broken or ugly. She saw someone beautiful, someone strong, someone worthy of celebration. The ceremony was set for 2 in the afternoon. The church had filled up with friends and family. John's father was notably absent, but Gabrielle was there, radiant in her own dress, preparing to walk her daughter-in-law down the aisle. She had brought gifts too, practical things that Tiana would need for her married life, and a note that she had written by hand, expressing her love and support. The music started. Gabrielle and Tiana linked arms and began to walk down the aisle. John stood at the altar, and when he saw Tiana, his face transformed completely. His eyes filled with tears. He smiled the kind of smile that comes from the deepest part of your soul, the kind that says, "I chose you, and I would choose you 1,000 times over." He stepped forward and took Tiana's hand from his mother's arm, and Gabrielle hugged them both before taking her seat. Terrell began the ceremony. He spoke about love, about commitment, about standing by each other through trials and triumphs. He knew the story of how John and Tiana had met, how they had navigated tragedy together, how John had supported her through recovery and helped her rebuild her life. So he spoke about what real love looked like. Not a love that was conditional on appearance or circumstance, but a love that was chosen every single day. They exchanged vows. John's voice was steady and strong as he promised to love her, to support her, to stand by her through everything that life would bring. Tiana's voice wavered with emotion as she made the same promises. And just as Terrell was about to pronounce them husband and wife, just as everyone was about to celebrate, the back doors of the church burst open. Isaiah Smith walked in, dressed in his full pastoral regalia, his collar prominently displayed. He walked down the center aisle with purpose, his face a mask of stern determination. The organ music stopped abruptly. Everyone turned to look at him in shock. "Stop," he said, his voice commanding. This ceremony cannot continue. I cannot allow this to proceed. Everyone, I want you to know that this union is not approved by God, and it will not be blessed by me or by this church. Everyone, get out. We are done here." The shock in the room was absolute. People gasped. Some stood up. The bride and groom froze, unable to process what was happening. Gabrielle stood up, and her face went white, then red with anger and hurt. This was her son's day. This was the most important moment of his life, and her husband was destroying it in front of everyone. Then, something extraordinary happened. Gabrielle stood up, walked to the front of the church, and faced her husband directly. She said nothing. She simply handed him an envelope. It contained divorce papers. She had prepared them in advance, just in case Isaiah crossed the line, and he had crossed it. "Sign them," she said quietly, but firmly. "I'm done." The church erupted into whispers and shocked silence. But Gabrielle wasn't done. She turned to Tiana and said, "Come here, baby." She took Tiana's hand and placed it in John's hand. Then she turned to Terrell and said, "Finish the ceremony." Terrell, stunned but supportive, nodded. But before he could speak, Tiana did something that would change everything. She stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for any announcements, and she asked to say something. Terrell, confused but willing, handed her the microphone. Tiana looked out at the congregation, at her new husband, at Gabrielle, and at Isaiah. Her voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. "My name is Tiana Johnson. Tiana Williams now, I guess. I know you all just witnessed that something shocking. Pastor Isaiah said I was unsuitable. He said I wasn't good enough for his son because of how I look. Because of these scars." She paused and looked directly at Isaiah. "But I want to tell you something about John's father. The Pastor Isaiah has never told anyone in this church. I want to tell you something about the man he really is." The silence in the church was deafening. "John and I have been together for 6 years, Tiana continued. "And in those 6 years, John has been the most loving, most supportive, most incredible partner anyone could ask for. He stood by me when I lost my parents. He supported me through recovery. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He paid for my education. He has been, in every way that matters, the best man I know." She turned to Isaiah. "But here's what John doesn't know, and here's what I'm about to tell this entire church. John is infertile. He cannot have biological children. He found this out years ago, and it devastated him. But he never told anyone because he was ashamed. And I want you to know, Pastor Isaiah, that I knew. I knew from the time John told me, and I have loved him every single day since. knowing that if we wanted to have children, we would have to use a sperm donor. I married him despite that. I have stood by him despite that. I have supported his fertility journey despite that. She held up her hand and gestured to her body, to her scars. I married a man with a condition that our society tells us is a tragedy and a shame. I married a man and committed to loving him and building a life with him, knowing that he couldn't give me biological children. And I did this because I love him. I did this because love is more than appearance. Love is more than perfection. Love is about seeing someone for who they are and choosing them anyway. She looked back at Isaiah. So my question for you, Pastor, is this. I was willing to marry your son and love him despite his infertility. I was willing to accept his imperfection. Why are you so unwilling to accept mine? What makes physical appearance more important than the character and the heart of a person? What makes your judgment of me based on my scars more valid than my choice to love someone based on his whole self? The church was silent. People had tears streaming down their faces. Isaiah's face had gone pale. He was being confronted, in front of his entire congregation, with his own hypocrisy. He was a pastor who preached about love and acceptance, and he was practicing judgment and cruelty. He was a man who had taught his son that unconditional love was important. Yet here he was, making his love for his son conditional on Tiana's appearance. Isaiah turned and walked out of the church without saying another word. Gabrielle walked over to Tiana and hugged her fiercely, whispering, "I'm so proud of you," over and over again. Terrell, shaking slightly, looked at John and Tiana and said, "Let's finish this ceremony. This couple has proven their love is real. Let's bless it properly." He said the final words, pronounced them husband and wife, and told John he could kiss his bride. When he did, the entire church stood up and applauded. People cried. They celebrated. They recognized that they had just witnessed something important. A young couple standing up for love, for acceptance, for the kind of character that makes us human. The reception continued. The party went on. But everyone knew that something had shifted. A pastor had been exposed in front of his congregation. A man had been forced to see himself clearly, and it was not a pretty sight. Days later, Isaiah sat alone in his study. He couldn't stop replaying Tiana's words in his mind. He thought about his marriage, about his wife, who had chosen their son over him. He thought about his son, who had chosen his love over his blessing. He thought about his daughter-in-law, who had the courage to speak truth to power in front of hundreds of people. And he thought about his own infertility, the secret he had been keeping from everyone except his wife. The same secret that Tiana had respected and honored. Yes, Isaiah had his own secret. Years ago, before he married Gabrielle, before he became a pastor, he had learned that he couldn't father biological children. It was something he had struggled with deeply, something that had made him feel inadequate and ashamed. When he and Gabrielle had their children, John and his younger sister, they had used a sperm donor. Isaiah had never publicly acknowledged this. He had never told his church. He had never told his extended family. He had carried this secret for decades, even as he preached about honesty and moral living from his pulpit. And in the moment when Tiana revealed John's infertility in front of everyone, as Isaiah had recognized himself. He had seen his own shame reflected back at him. He had realized that he had judged Tiana for something she couldn't control, for being a survivor of trauma, while he himself harbored a secret that made him feel like he was less of a man. It took him 2 weeks to work up the courage to reach out. He called John and asked if they could meet. They met at a coffee shop, neutral ground. Isaiah was nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. He ordered coffee and sat across from his son, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry." John listened as his father told him that he had been wrong, that his judgment had been cruel, that he had let his own insecurities and shame cloud his vision. He told John about his own infertility, about why Tiana's words had hit so hard. Never he told him that he realized he had wanted John to have what he felt he couldn't have: perfection, completeness, a life without complications. And in doing so, he had rejected someone who had shown more character and love than he himself had demonstrated. "I want to apologize to Tiana," Isaiah said, "and I want to ask for forgiveness from you. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." John, who had his mother's capacity for forgiveness and grace, said, "You have to apologize to her yourself. But if you do it genuinely, if you truly mean it, I think she'll forgive you. She's better at forgiveness than I am." Isaiah went to John and Tiana's home that evening. Tiana answered the door, and when she saw him, she stiffened. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to cause problems," he said. "I'm here to apologize. Can I come in?" They sat in their living room, and Isaiah told them everything. He told them about his own infertility, about his shame, about why he had reacted the way he did to Tiana. He took full responsibility for his cruelty. He told Tiana that she was one of the most courageous people he had ever met, that she had put him in his place in a way he needed, and that he was deeply sorry for judging her. Tiana, who had every right to turn him away, listened carefully. She asked him questions. She wanted to understand not just his apology, but his journey. And when she felt his sincerity, she forgave him. It wasn't a quick forgiveness. It was one that came from a place of understanding that people can grow, that shame can cause people to act in ways they regret, and that redemption is possible if someone is willing to do the work. Gabrielle, who had been waiting to see how this conversation would go, saw that her husband was genuinely sorry. She didn't immediately move back in, but she didn't file the divorce papers either. She said she would give him a chance to prove through his actions that he had truly changed. And over the following months, Isaiah did the work of redemption. He went to therapy to process his own shame. He started being honest in his sermons about his own struggles instead of preaching perfection. He became closer to his son and more genuinely supportive of his daughter-in-law. Eventually, Gabrielle moved back home, and their marriage took on new meaning. Not based on pretense and hidden secrets, but based on authentic vulnerability and acceptance. In the meantime, Tiana's fashion design business had taken off. She started with small freelance projects, doing custom designs for friends and friends of friends. But as word spread about her talent, her designs became more sought after. Women loved her pieces because she understood what it meant to want to feel beautiful and confident. She understood the power of clothing to transform how someone saw themselves. A year after the wedding, she opened her own small studio. It started as a converted garage, but as her business grew, she rented a proper space in a shop district. She hired other designers to help her. She started doing custom wedding dresses like the one she had designed for herself. She worked with women who, like her, wanted to feel seen and beautiful. Her business became known not just for the quality of the designs, but for the story behind it. The story of a woman who had survived trauma and had turned that experience into something beautiful. By the second year of her business, she had a waiting list of 6 months. Celebrities started requesting her work. Local news outlets did features on her story. And through it all, John was there, supporting her, believing in her, celebrating her success. Isaiah, watching his son's marriage flourish and watching Tiana's business boom, finally understood what he had almost destroyed. He had been so focused on externals, appearance, perfection, the judgment of others, that he had almost missed something sacred: his son's happiness, built on the foundation of real, true, unconditional love. The moral of this story, the thing I want every single one of you to understand, that is this: we live in a world that judges people by their appearance, their circumstances, their perceived imperfections. But true character, true worth, cannot be measured by how someone looks. It can only be measured by how they love, how they show up, how they choose to see others. John chose to see Tiana's strength instead of her scars. Gabrielle chose to see her daughter-in-law's character instead of her appearance. And Tiana chose to see John's heart instead of his limitations. That is what real love is. That is what real acceptance is. And Isaiah, when he finally saw clearly, learned that the greatest shame isn't in having imperfections. It's in refusing to see the beauty in others when they're standing right in front of you. The wedding that was supposed to be disrupted became a moment of truth, and the pastor who came to condemn was himself condemned by his own hypocrisy. And the couple that was judged unsuitable became a symbol of what real love actually looks like. Now I have to ask you something, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Whose fault do you think this all was? Do you blame Isaiah for his judgment and his cruelty? Do you think Gabrielle made the right choice in choosing her son over her marriage? And most importantly, what would you have done if you were in John or Tiana's position? Would you have fought for your love the way they did? Or would you have given up? I want you to comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me whose side you're on. Tell me what this story made you feel. Because that's how we build community here. That's how we connect with each other. And I promise you, we're going to read your comments. But before you go, I need to remind you of something. You've spent the last hour with me, listening to this story. There are more stories here on this channel. Stories of love, stories of redemption, stories that will make you cry and laugh and think about life differently. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Like this video so it reaches more people. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's being judged, someone who needs to understand what real love looks like, share this video with them. We upload new stories every single day, and they span different genres, different themes, all with the same goal: to remind you that your life matters, your story matters, and you're not alone in your struggles. We're building something special here, and I want you to be part of it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of our precious family. I'll see you in the next story.